the great conservative movement of America and of our time. A brush fire of freedom that's being lit all over this country. We, as an irate, tireless American populace, will overcome the few radical leftists that control the levers of power today. Joe Biden's failed economic policies has given us inflation like you can't believe, and the border is in disarray.
It's amazing how few of the people commenting on this have actually bothered to go see what's happening. Well, Congressman Andy Biggs of Arizona actually went to the border.
Biggs, where's Andy? Boy, oh boy, Andy. There's a guy. He's tough.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of What's the Biggs Idea? I am Andy Biggs. I'm the congressman from Arizona's 5th Congressional District, and I am so happy you'd take some time out of your schedule to watch this podcast. I call it a semi-regular podcast. We know it's going to come out every week or so, and we're just never sure what time and when, so please follow us at biggs.house.gov. And we'll make sure that you can find out when you can see us live or watch the follow-up podcast. I am delighted to have with me a special guest. Today we have Edward Ring. He is a senior fellow at the Center for American Greatness. He's also a contributing editor and senior fellow with the California Policy Center, which he co-founded in 2013 and served as its first president. He is the author of Fixing California, Abundance, Pragmatism, and Optimism, and The Abundance Choice, Our Fight for More Water in California. And just the titles of his books, as a guy who lives in Arizona next door and watches California, it's probably indicates that Edward is an optimist, at least more so than I am. If he could write a book called Fixing California, that's fantastic. We're going to talk today about a piece, and I would refer you to it on amgreatness.com. I think that's it, amgreatness.com. Is it amgreatness.org? But yeah, you're going to want to go there and read Edward's piece called Renewables Aren't Renewable. And when I read this piece early in the week, I said, we've got to talk to this gentleman in person. And there's so many provocative statements and ideas and thoughts in this piece. I want to read one of them and get us going there. Edward, you wrote and after you've described some things, you said the environmental toll, quote, renewables are poised to inflict on the planet. And so I agree with that. And then we'll talk a little bit about the hubris of people who are advancing this. But I want, just so our audience knows, what does the world describe and define as renewable energy?
Typically, it refers to, well, there's a couple of ways to describe it, but the primary definition is you don't have to put any fuel into the generating plant. So if you have a field of photovoltaic panels, once you've built the panels, you're supposedly done, because the sun will shine on them, and the sun is the energy input. The same goes for wind turbines. The wind will turn the blades, and the blades will spin the generator. And so you don't have to put any fuel into them other than wind and sun. Some people refer to nuclear power as renewable as well. I think that's a little bit of a stretch. Nuclear power is clean, but you do have to go mine the uranium or whatever radioactive material you're using for nuclear power. But that's sort of the range of definitions for renewable.
Well, thanks for talking about that. And you had another provocative statement here right towards the beginning of your piece, and I want you to expand on this, because I think this is an important point that we got to get today. Is you described our policies today in America as, quote, the misanthropic folly of America's current energy policies, close quote. I know what I think that sentence meant, and I have to say I agreed with it 100%, but I wanted to get your thoughts. What did you mean by this sentence, and why are our policies misanthropic or anti-human being?
Sure. Well, misanthropic is just a big word for cruel, and it
Yeah.
is cruel. And I guess misanthropic also means sort of anti-human. Uh, the point there is renewable energy costs a lot, and the people who are least able to afford renewable energy are the people that we are supposedly in this country, especially Democrats, but everyone is concerned about helping the disadvantaged, helping people that are low income. And the low income communities, the people that work in jobs that aren't necessarily giving them excess cash to pay their bills, it's a big hit. If you're somebody that's economically successful and your utility bill doubles, you grumble a little and you write the check or you pay it online and you're done, and it's not a big deal. Whereas if you're somebody in a low income household and you're working maybe two jobs and you just barely make ends meet and your utility bill doubles, you're in a tough spot. The other thing that makes these renewable energy policies cruel is not just the direct impact of expensive renewable energy, but the ripple effect that has in the economy. When we make it impossible, and it's not just energy, it's also water, it's also transportation. When we make everything in the country more expensive because we're trying to make everything, quote, sustainable, where we lose the ability, for example, to build abundant, affordable housing. And that's the biggest expense that people usually incur in their households. So when you make everything that people need, the absolute essentials, food and shelter and electricity and water, cost more, you're affecting the entire economy. You're affecting businesses as well that can't afford the energy inputs, so they take their businesses offshore, for example. And now you're killing jobs. So in every way, every angle that you look at this, it's cruel.
Yeah, and so when you're talking about it, we're talking about this move to make renewable energy the energy that replaces all other energy, which just seems ludicrous to me. But let's just get to this point, because I think we're going to need to just get down into the weeds just a little bit more. You said renewable energy cannot possibly scale adequately to replace fossil fuels. Mm-hmm. Again, I think that's a prescient statement. And tell me, why can't renewable energies, renewable forms of energy replace fossil fuels? Why can't they scale up to do that? You mentioned so many things in your piece, and I want to get to as many as we can in what little time we have. So please, help us understand that statement.
Sure. Well, the first thing to think about is the percentage of energy that's provided by renewables. Wind and solar, it was touted as a great achievement. I think last year that we have data, which would be 2021, it was 22% of all electricity came from renewables. Now, in that statement, you have to understand that wind and solar are intermittent, so you had to build extra natural gas power capacity, because that can be fired up and fired down quickly in order to fill in whenever the wind stops blowing or the sun stops shining. So there's and you also have to build all of the transmission lines from solar farms and wind farms. So there's a tremendous amount of so-called balance of plant involved when you build solar and wind power, because it's intermittent and you have to cover for all of that, and it's distributed all over the place geographically, and you have to provide for that with more transmission resources. But 22% is still a lot. The problem with that is we're talking about electrifying the entire economy, the residential, industrial, transportation, commercial. All of those four major sectors of the economy rely on energy, and electricity is only 38% of that energy. The rest of it is direct inputs, mostly of petroleum and natural gas. So if you actually look at how much wind and solar would be contributing to a fully electrified American economy, now you're only looking at something that's about 6% of the way, not even quite that far. So you have to imagine what it would take to have 18 times as many wind farms and solar farms. And you have to take into account the fact that all of the northern latitudes, most of the Northeast in America, where most people live, doesn't have enough sunlight. You have to take into account the winter, where in northern latitudes, there's perhaps as little as 8 hours of sun a day or 9 hours of sun a day. And solar doesn't really work when the sun is on the horizon. So you're really looking at what they call full sun equivalent hours of perhaps 4 hours a day. And that's if it's not cloudy and stormy. The seasonal variation, people talk a lot about the difficulty of balancing daily loads. And in California, that's a state where we have a lot of sun, and we're at a relatively lower latitude, especially down in Southern California. But even in California, the yield from solar energy farms is only about 13%. So you put in 100 megawatts of solar power in the winter, you're only going to get 13 megawatts of output on average. And you've got to balance the rest of that with battery storage, and you've got to overbuild your solar farms to get that 100 megawatts back. So you're actually building 700 megawatts of solar capacity in order to get 100 megawatts of solar power. And you've got to build battery backup to store all of that. But that still doesn't solve your problem of seasonality. If you overbuild your solar farms, you can't just overbuild it for the average yield that you get during the year. You have to overbuild it for the yields you're going to get in the winter. So these kinds of constraints make the idea of expanding our solar and wind capacity by 18 times or more a very daunting prospect. And you're looking at all of the transmission lines. Now take that and consider that for the whole world. One of the things that you want to take into account is how much energy does each person require on average. And you can go to very reliable sources like the British Petroleum Statistical Review of Global Energy. You can just Google that, it come right up, have a look at the charts and tables in there. They're even downloadable as spreadsheets. So it's very easy to get this data. And here it is. If everyone on Earth used half as much energy as Americans per person currently use, and that, by the way, that would be including Americans, if we cut our energy use in half, and then if everybody else in the world got that much energy, we would have to double the amount of energy that's produced in the world. So that's sort of the minimum. If you think about this realistically and what people need to achieve prosperity around the world, that's the minimum goal that we should be setting. We need to figure out how to double energy production on the planet. Now imagine how much wind and solar that would take.
Yeah, and Edward, what's interesting about that, a couple of things. Number one, just because you can, let's say you could double the amount of energy produced, you have to have a way to transmit that energy to where it is needed to function, and whether it's a manufacturing plant, a house, a commercial zone, whatever it is. So you have to have the transmission lines and the generation kickers that you will need to move that. So that also is an infrastructure headache, but another infrastructure headache, because you were talking about batteries, and I can't help but think of things like electric vehicles, et cetera. The amount of critical minerals that are necessary for a battery, let's say to fuel, to provide the fuel source for an electric vehicle, it's substantial, and substantially more than a traditional automobile. And you cite a book about, I think it's red cobalt in the Congo, and what's happening there. Can you expand for us on essentially okay, and there's another aspect to it. So we are dependent because of our own environmental laws here. We can't mine. We have critical minerals here we can't touch. It's okay to touch them somewhere else and take advantage of some other nation. So that's a problem. But so we, by being reliant, we're reliant on political and economic features of the international system, which are not always favorable for us to produce these types of products and extract this kind of minerals that we need. Tell us about the red Congo.
Yeah, red Congo. That's a pretty harrowing story, and it's being repeated all over the world. I didn't mention biofuel, which is also considered renewable, and where we've
Right.
already paved over 500,000 square miles. We have created biofuel monocultures that ironically use petroleum-based fertilizer. And that represents 2% of our liquid transportation fuel is biofuel nowadays in the world. And it's already consumed 500,000 square miles. And for perspective, there's only 10 million square miles, 10 to 12 million square miles of farmland in the whole world. So we've already burned through, 15, 20% of it for biofuel plantations. And we're just ripping out rainforests all over the Indonesia, Malaysia, and Brazil and elsewhere. And so there's a lot of environmental destruction happening for all of this. And to come back to the critical minerals, what we've got, as you say, are situations where there aren't any environmental regulations to make the extraction of these minerals at least, somewhat mitigating the impact, doing things about the tailing ponds and coming up with ways to extract these minerals that minimize damage to the environment. And it's the exact opposite in West Africa and places like that. We also don't have any labor laws in those nations. So you've got militias, private militias that are essentially using child slave labor and adult slave labor as well, of course, in appalling conditions to mine this stuff. And the irony again is that where then we see commercial marketing campaigns in America touting electric vehicles as a virtuous choice. And, maybe if we were willing to mine our lithium in California and our cobalt in Nevada and get everything we needed for these vehicles here in the United States, we would be conscious of the environmental price and the labor costs, and we would be doing it in a responsible way. And then we would truly understand how costly it is to try to do this stuff. And I've got to mention just how much stuff we're talking about.
Yeah.
Now, an electric vehicle uses 6 times as much minerals, steel. It needs a steel frame because the battery weighs so much. So in terms of overall resource input, you're looking at 6 times as many materials in terms of value going into an electric car compared to an internal combustion car. But then there's also we talking about the consumer end now. On the production end, when you're building a solar or a wind generating plant, per unit of energy, you're using 20 times as much material as you would need to just build a natural gas generating plant. 20 times as much concrete and steel and copper. To electrify the American economy with just 50% solar, you would need to use about 10 years of the entire US production of copper to do that, which, we need the copper for other things. So you can't, 10 years of our supply, it's actually more than 10 years. These are astonishing numbers. And they prove that the idea that we're going to be able to use wind and solar power and battery backup storage to produce, and then in the items that consume power in America or in the world, is just absolutely impossible.
Yeah, I'm just stunned every time I read something about this and hear more about this. And the other aspect to this too is to keep your battery charged, so where you can use it in an efficient manner. I literally in a congressional hearing once, Edward, we had somebody testify about the farm tractors and combines, et cetera, that need to be electrified. And you point this out in your piece, that they typically work those 18 hours a day, and there's no way to charge them within 6. I'm sure that an innovator could come up with some reason, but how do you do that? How do you deal with that kind of constraint on productivity because of the necessity of charging your battery periodically?
Yeah, you're not only looking at farm equipment, you're looking at ships, on the ocean. The only way you can do it theoretically is you either do what's called a hot swap, where you have a battery that can be rapidly mechanically removed from the vehicle, and a fresh charged battery can be inserted, which means you have to buy 3 batteries in order to go through a duty cycle. That's an 18-hour duty cycle for every piece of equipment you've got. Or you could potentially try to use hydrogen fuel cells, which are supposedly green if you can produce the hydrogen in a green manner. Most hydrogen is stripped out of natural gas, so that's not necessarily renewable. But these are the kinds of alternatives you would have to implement in order to electrify the farm equipment and to electrify shipping on the ocean. And again, the expense of doing something like that, and you'd lose capacity as well if you've got to fill up your add to the weight and the cargo capacity for your batteries and your fuel cells and your compressed hydrogen tanks. Hydrogen, by the way, does not compress nearly as efficiently as natural gas. It has to be stored at 10,000 psi, whereas natural gas is stored at 300 psi. So you can imagine how heavy the tanks are to store usable amounts of hydrogen. So all of this stuff just has a tremendous cost.
This morning, I heard I attended a meeting where we had the head of a major American oil company attend, and he said no type of energy can displace another kind, but rather every kind of energy that gets developed ends up adding on. And so he provided some charts which I thought were interesting. He said, for instance, the combustibles, wood and dung, we actually in the world we burn the same amount today as we did in 1900. We do, and people use that as energy. And then he brought in oil. We basically use just about the same amount of oil today as we did, over time. The same percentage of the energy use, and natural gas. And now even with your solar and wind, it's just a small fraction, and it has not displaced even the biofuel that you have, and not from wood and dung. It just doesn't. It hasn't displaced that even. So I guess I want to ask you about that, about how. I mean, how do people come up with the conclusion that we are going to replace all these other types of energy with actually some very few unreliable, unsustainable energy sources?
Well, that's the tough question, because it comes back to the fact that until we are able to produce enough power to lift everyone in the world into prosperity, I mean, the correlation between energy consumption and prosperity is 1-to-1. You cannot achieve prosperity until you have a minimum amount of energy available and affordable to people all over the world. And we've seen this in every country on earth, and the correlations are just absolutely overlap completely. So you're right. As you come up with new ways to produce energy, you're not displacing the old ways yet, because we haven't gotten to that point where there is enough energy for everyone. I think that answers your question. By the way, they call it biomass, and it's interesting to mention biomass, because if you look at the renewables, according to the Energy Information Administration, British Petroleum Statistical Yearbook, it turns out that a lot of the percentage of the so-called renewables that we're recording as renewable power generation, a big part of that pie is the so-called biomass. And this goes back to what's going to happen in continents like Africa, in nations that are still developing, where we're not letting them get financing to build natural gas power plants. So 2 things happen. First of all, they don't. Their population growth is still exponential in these poverty-stricken nations, because that's another 1-to-1 correlation. If you don't have prosperity, you are relying on child labor for subsistence agriculture, and you're having large families. So what's happened, the second thing that happens, along with the fact that you don't have population stabilization in nations where you're not allowed to develop practical energy anymore, is they have to go out and further into the wilderness to get fuel and to get protein.
Right.
So they're killing endangered species and they're wiping out precious rainforest because they have no choice. That's the only way they can feed themselves and cook their food, stay warm when it's cold. So this is a tremendous catastrophe that's unfolding right now because we're not letting developing nations develop practical energy so that they can also achieve prosperity.
It's what I call the unintended consequence of hubris, and the hubris that we have here is doing the exact is having the exact contrary impact that these folks want to have happen, and it leads to something you said, which I think is right there. And I think it's hubris. I think I view it as ultimately, because you discussed this in your piece a little bit about. Some people, and I would be one of those people who believe that for some rabid environmentalists, this is a faith or a dogma as opposed to a scientific enterprise on how to, or even, in my opinion, a philosophical enterprise on how to allow most people to try to gain economic prosperity, which would in turn make them freer, make them healthier, become more educated, be able to fulfill their lives in a more abundant way. It's this lack of faith in humanity and God. It's this kind of authoritarian hubris that comes along where they says, no, we're not going to let anybody else do this. We're not going to let ourselves do it. And I want to get to this because you said something, and I wanted, because we're just about out of time, I want to get your thoughts on this. You said critics of the renewables mania correctly identify climate crisis passions as a new popular religion for a postmodern culture that has lost its way. And I love that because I'm reminded of our postmodern friends, the Frankfurt School, and the whole delineation of philosophy that has basically attacked our society from that. But and then you go to say it is the elites who have truly lost their way. They have not only transmuted their natural human need for meaning and purpose into embracing the green religion, but they have become so intoxicated with their wealth and power that they have convinced themselves that they are uniquely qualified to control the destiny of the world. And then you use my favorite word, hubris. And so, Edward, I'm going to let you have the last word here and kind of send us home thinking about the very profound statement that you made at the end of your piece.
Well, it's interesting that Christians and other religious people in the world may end up actually taking a more scientific approach to how we resolve energy and environmentalist challenges, because they haven't allowed the sort of green religion to displace their own faith in a higher power and a purpose in life. And people, I think, no expert, but I believe that on this matter that people want purpose. Everybody needs purpose in life. And if you're an atheist, you have to find it somewhere else. And the idea of saving the planet is it's kind of an intoxicating cause. It's very sexy when you talk to people in marketing, communications, and you're trying to sell the idea of the climate crisis, and you show you are appealing to very primal fears, a burning planet, a flooding planet. And so this kind of intensity is a way that people can recover that what may be missing in their lives because they lack a religious faith. I think a lot of the people, maybe I'm a little too hard on some of these elites. There are people, it's really kind of mystifying. They're extremely intelligent, well-intentioned people that for some reason they look at these numbers, the numbers that we talked about all through this this broadcast here, and it just goes right over their heads in some respects. They go, we've got to do it. Well, what we've got to do is research new breakthroughs so that we will come up with new ways to double the energy production in the planet. And that's a scientific challenge and an economic challenge that requires more research. But to just try to deploy the things that we do have to work with to supposedly replace very affordable, very abundant, very practical solutions that we've been using all along, instead of just trying to make fossil fuel cleaner, which we've done a very good job of, and we just need to roll that out around the world and keep it up so that people can achieve prosperity. And instead, they're clinging to these renewable solutions. And it really is inexplicable if you don't try to explain it from some kind of non-rational perspective where it has become a faith. And there's also a lot of money and there's a lot of power involved in enforcing the rationing, the inevitable rationing that has to come about if we stick to this renewable strategy that we're on.
I just got to say, I love what you said, a non-rational approach, power and money, and a replacement of faith. I think all of those figure into what we see today in what I would argue is an authoritarian bent of the left in the United States of America today. And in fact, anywhere the left exists, I think that there's an authoritarian undercurrent that just naturally flows from the idea of wanting to control other people. Thanks, Edward. I want to thank you so much for joining me today. It's enlightening. Again, I encourage everybody to go to amgreatness.com. Take a look at the piece by Edward, excellent piece. You can follow him at edring, at EDRING. His website is californiapolicycenter.org. And as always, you can follow me on Twitter at RepAndyBiggsAZ, Instagram at RepAndyBiggs, Truth at RepAndyBiggsAZ, or at my official website, biggs.house.gov. You can get this podcast, the audio version, at Spotify or Apple Podcast, and we'll join you again soon. And Edward, I wish you the best and hope to talk to you again soon, and encourage everyone to read this piece, think about it, and let's all get involved to save this country. You can shrink Washington and save America. That's what my goal, and we'll talk to you next time on What's the Big